we continue. Yeah. Okay, so let me start by thanking SAPAM for making sure that the book becomes a reality. And in particular, I think I must highlight Professor Shai, who ensured, who pushed me that the book could be here today at the conference. You know, with books, you write it, and it sits in your computer, and it can sit for a very long time. Then reviewers tell you things, some things you might not like very much, and that causes further delays. You then finally get back to it, you attend to what the reviewers are saying, and maybe you put it aside again for a while. So I really want to thank SAPAM and particularly Professor Shai, who was really on my case, who made many follow-ups. Have you attended to the reviewers' reports? After I've done that, they checked, and Dr. John Malepo, again, for all the coordination around that. And of course, UNISA Press as well for agreeing to co-publish the book. I think that was important, particularly Dr. Tshwane, who's the acting director of UNISA Press. So I think I should acknowledge that, and thanks for the invitation again to be here. So some of you might know about this book. I'm introducing the book now. So I wrote this book. It's called Political Economy of Post-Apartheid South Africa, immediately after leaving government. So I had been in government after spending some time with Professor Sate, the one who was presenting on the model here. We were all at the National Institute of Economic Policy in the 1990s. And then I worked in government until 2009. And I thought there was need to write a comprehensive text that described what I'd call the political economy of post-apartheid South Africa. There had been other texts before that had largely looked at the apartheid period, but there wasn't, I argued at the time, a comprehensive text that was looking at the political economy of post-apartheid South Africa. So I did this book. And a few years later, I felt the book had just described the issues. And I felt it had not really given enough insights into policy, partly reflecting from my own encounters and experience in government. I had a privilege to work at the Department of Trade and Industry. I worked at the Department of Public Enterprises, and I worked at the presidency. That's where I spent most of my time, 8 years in the presidency at the time, this was from 2000 to 2009. So I decided to write this book. And this was around 2015. And I was thinking about, it looks like we're not improving. Society is not improving when we think about social and economic inclusion, I would say area of my interest, dealing with issues of poverty, dealing with challenges of inequality, access to services, and so forth. So I did this book, Economic and Social Inclusion in Post-Apartheid South Africa, analyzing various dynamics in the economy and in society. And I came to a conclusion, or at least the book was arguing, the numbers and the analysis was suggesting that things may be worsening. This was 2015. The analysis was suggesting that social and economic development was no longer progressing in South Africa. And I tried to think about, what was going on at the time, looking at the numbers, and it largely pointing to the policies that maybe we didn't have the right policies and we had not implemented the necessary reforms in the policies and institutions and the sequencing of those reforms. Fast forward to where we are today, 2022, and I started writing this book. We're launching today about a year ago. And I was trying to go back, think a bit about the discussions we had when I was in government. So around 2004, former President Tshwane, I was in the policy unit of the presidency then, wrote a short piece to a number of us, those of us who were in government around the time will remember, because I think this was accessed by many, many people, not just the ministers. And of course, us in the policy unit, we accessed many things that former President Big was writing. And of course, we're part of the target audience for such writes-up. This one was raising a question whether government is appropriately capacitated, well, whether government has requisite capacities and whether it's appropriately capacitated for what government wants to achieve. So you recall this was immediately after the elections, I think 2004 elections, with a very fresh mandate. And the question was, I mean, we had all these targets about halving unemployment, halving poverty, reducing inequality significantly, growing the economy by very high targets, and all of that. And the question that we're wrestling with at the time was whether we organized as government appropriately and whether we have the requisite capacities to achieve that goal. So I've gone back to that question in this book that we're launching today, because I'm suspecting, I've been thinking that maybe that's where the answer is, or maybe that's where the question is. So it may very well be that there may be challenge with policies, there may be a challenge with implementation of those policies, but maybe more fundamentally, there's a challenge with how government is organized. And when I talk about organization of the government, I talk about both horizontally and vertically, as well as the various portfolios and functions of the government. So whether government is organized in a proper manner to deal with the challenges and particularly to achieve the targets and the goals that we have set as society, and in this case, as government. That's one aspect of it. So I've had to spend some time understanding the institutional architecture of the government in South Africa. The way I've tried to do this was to do it at a comparative context. So looking at South Africa in comparison with countries that I think South Africa can be compared with. So I took Malaysia, I took Singapore, I took Brazil, Taiwan, I may be forgetting some countries. And then within the African continent, I took Mauritius, Botswana, and Nigeria. Don't ask me why I include Nigeria. In all my analyses, I always include Nigeria. I always feel that we cannot exclude the biggest economy in the continent when we do this kind of analysis. So given the analysis that I've done around the institutional architecture and juxtaposing that with development outcomes, so the performance in the economy, dealing with challenges of poverty, of inequality, and other challenges that we face, I come to a conclusion that fundamentally the challenge that we're facing is largely with how government is organized. And the book deals with a number of issues around that, raises a number of questions, engages with what other scholars have said around the same issues. For instance, scholars have argued that you have to get rid of a provincial sphere of government. I engage with those issues, whether there's merit in that argument, that the provincial sphere should not exist, as some argue. And just as I conclude, Chair, when we talk about capacity, the way I've tried to approach it in the book is to look at the various types of capacity. So not just political, which is what we often do. I've looked at technical capacity, I've looked at implementation capacity, I've looked at ideational capacity, and most importantly, leadership capacity. You'll see when you read the book, I make a lot of emphasis in what I call thought leadership, not just general leadership or general political leadership, that we must address thought leadership. Thought leadership, in a sense, as I describe it in the book, and I've written a bit about this in other areas, is that you need people in government who are able to understand the context, who are able to understand the history of that context, who are able to understand why a particular problem exists or persists, or a challenge doesn't go away, and think through the solutions around that. I'm putting it in a very simple way, but broadly, that's how I look at state capacity. I develop a developmental state framework. So in order to look at the organization of government and development outcomes, you need a kind of a framework that can guide that. So, I make use of what other scholars have done, and I shape this for the book. And in the center of this is the institutional architecture. So the structure and the reforms that need to take place, which influence implementation, influences development agenda, influences planning, influences partnerships and oversight, which is embedded autonomy in the literature, and of course decision-making and various aspects. This point I'm making about capacity, and that we don't seem to be really having a problem of capacity. So if you think about state capacity, you can think of it as human capital, but also human capital both in terms of numbers, in terms of productivity, and various factors that relate to human capital. You can think of it as an organization of the state or government, and also policies and systems that must be in place for government to function effectively. So in conclusion, the point I make in the book as a conclusion is that the National Development Plan, how it's structured, how it's developed, and how it's implemented matters. And of course, I look at these all other countries, our development plan is relatively different, actually very different from development plans of many countries that I looked at, and I think there's an issue around that. I'm aware that it's been reviewed, and some of us have been involved with that review, and hopefully it will result into a revised development plan. You do need a development agenda. It's not enough to have a development plan. Leadership is critical, and the Planning Commission, though important, how it's structured and how it functions also matters greatly. And of course, having the right people in the right portfolios